The air in the Kenyan savannah trembled as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Before the seasoned ranger Elias Vance, a man who had walked these lands for nearly 6 decades, whose boots had pressed into the red soil under countless dawns and dusks, knelt a creature of raw, untamed majesty. A massive mother gorilla, her dark fur rippling in the breeze, her massive shoulders heaving with trembling breaths, extended her arms toward him. In those arms lay her most precious treasure, an unconscious infant, limp as a fallen leaf. There was no roar of warning, no flash of teeth. Only eyes, deep amber, shimmering with a silent desperation that pierced deeper than any weapon could. Eyes that said in a language beyond words, "You are my only hope." Elias felt a weight heavier than the heat of the sun fall upon him in that instant, not the weight of fear, but of trust. The kind of trust that crosses the boundaries of species, that defies the instincts of survival. His medical kit suddenly felt pitifully small, his decades of experience like a thin shield against the enormity of this moment. The air was thick, not just with tension, but with something sacred. It was as if the entire savannah had stilled to witness this offering. Only the mother's ragged breathing broke the silence, each exhale carrying the scent of leaves, earth, and heartbreak. Elias knew what this was, the surrender of a mother who had nothing left to lose. The righteous care for the needs of their animals, but the kindest acts of the wicked are cruel. And here, standing in the glow of an African sun that painted the acacia shadows long and soft, he realized he was standing inside a miracle, one born from tragedy and trust. That morning had begun like any other in this sprawling cradle of life. The land singing in the language of survival and peace. The African sun spilled golden light through the lattice of ancient acacia branches, dappling the grasslands below like pieces of a broken crown. Somewhere high above the earth, in a living cathedral of leaves and light, a gorilla family moved with the slow grace of beings who knew their place in creation. Their world was a tapestry woven of gentle grunts, rustling leaves, and the steady crunch of tender shoots. The mother, powerful and proud, cradled her infant, a tiny soul whose wide, liquid dark eyes reflected the innocence of all things new. To the baby, every vine was a swing, every insect a miracle, every moment a discovery. Today was special. Today, for the very first time, the little one was brave enough to test its independence, climbing without the familiar weight of its mother's embrace. Tiny wrinkled fingers clung to the rough bark, muscles quivering, a heartbeat racing with equal parts fear and excitement. The mother hovered close, rumbling softly from her chest, the unspoken music of maternal love. Every inch the baby gained was a triumph, but ambition, innocent and uncalculated, reached higher. A branch just out of reach called to the little one, and it stretched. Too far, too soon, its grip faltered. For a heartbeat, time fractured. The baby hung in midair, suspended above the green expanse below, wide eyes reflecting the endless sky, and then it fell. The silence of the fall was unbearable, broken only by the brittle snap of branches, ending in the muffled, dreadful thud of a body meeting earth. The jungle froze. The mother's cry tore through the air like a wound-made sound, a cry not of anger, but of a soul breaking. She scrambled down the tree, hands tearing through foliage until she found her child among crushed leaves, unmoving. She lifted the limp form to her chest, rocking, murmuring, searching for breath, for movement, for life. But there was nothing. Her cries deepened into guttural sobs that rolled across the savannah like distant thunder, the sound of a mother's heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. Even the stork in the sky knows her appointed seasons, but my people do not know the requirements of the Lord. The land listened in solemn silence, as if creation itself mourned with her miles away. Elias Vance was guiding his battered old Jeep along a dusty track, the tires spitting small stones into the dry air. Nearly 60 years he had lived in the embrace of this wild land, a man shaped by the rhythms of Africa, the songs of dawn, the stillness of danger, the unspoken law that every heartbeat here must earn its place. He knew the sounds of this place, the territorial roar of lions, the chatter of baboons, the cry of fish eagles overhead. But what reached him now was none of these. It was something far more terrible, the unfiltered voice of grief. It threaded through the wind, weaving into his bones, and without hesitation he cut the engine. The savannah's sudden silence magnified. The sound, a low, mournful call, repeated, breaking, shivering with desperation. Instinct moved him. Rifle slung across his shoulder for reassurance, binoculars around his neck, Elias stepped out, boots sinking into the red earth. He moved quietly, like the shadow of an old tree, blending into a land that knew him as one of its own. With every step, the cry grew clearer, pulling him forward. The sun bore down with its fierce, unwavering gaze, but the air felt cold with the weight of what he was walking toward. His heart quickened, not with fear, but with a dawning awareness that he was about to meet something no textbook, no training, could prepare him for. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. And in that moment, Elias realized that sometimes the wild does not call for our courage to face danger. It calls for our courage to face love. The cries led Elias into the shadow of an ancient acacia, its gnarled limbs reaching like the arms of an old prophet toward the burning sky. There, through a veil of trembling leaves, he saw her, the great mother gorilla. She was down on her knees, her immense body hunched over the small, limp figure in her arms. Her fur was dusted with the pale pollen of crushed grass, her shoulders rising and falling with labored breaths. Her massive hands, capable of breaking bones, were now trembling as if they held the most fragile thing in the universe, which, in truth, they did. Elias froze, not out of fear, but reverence. He felt like a man stepping into a sacred temple, where the altar was grief and the worship was love. The mother's eyes lifted to his, and in that single gaze, centuries of instinct fell away. There was no challenge, no warning, only a surrender so complete it ached to witness. She shifted almost awkwardly, as if torn between holding on and letting go. Then, in a motion so deliberate it made Elias' throat tighten, she extended her arms toward him, offering her child. The air thickened with meaning. Every rustle of leaves, every grain of dust floating in the sunlight seemed to hold its place. Unwilling to interrupt this moment, Elias stepped forward slowly, the crunch of his boots on dry grass sounding impossibly loud. When his hands finally touched the infant, he felt the cool stillness of its small body. No rise of breath, no flutter of pulse. But there was weight, the weight of possibility, however slim. The mother lingered, her huge amber eyes locked on him, as if measuring the worth of her gamble. He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. And in that instant, Elias knew this was no longer just an animal rescue. This was a covenant forged in the raw language of survival and trust, binding man and beast under the same desperate hope, kneeling in the dry grass. Elias set down his worn leather medical kit, a relic of countless emergencies, but never one quite like this. His fingers moved with both urgency and care, as if each movement might either anchor the infant to life or let it drift away forever. He checked the airway first, brushing away a smear of crushed leaves from the tiny nostrils. The mother's shadow loomed over him, silent but unyielding, her breath quick and uneven. He pressed 2 fingers gently against the baby's throat. Nothing. A heaviness coiled in his chest, but he would not yield to it. He tilted the small head back and gave 2 delicate breaths, watching the chest rise faintly, so faintly, it was almost imperceptible. Then compressions, steady, rhythmic, each one a silent prayer. The world around them seemed to vanish. The vast savanna reduced to the size of this small circle of grass, where a man and a gorilla fought for the same heartbeat. The air grew hotter, the cicadas louder, but Elias kept his focus. He had seen death before, too many times, but never with an audience like this. The mother's hand hovered near his shoulder, almost touching, as if she wanted to lend her strength to his. Minutes stretched into eternities. Then on the 5th cycle, a tremor rippled through the tiny body. A gasp, thin, raspy, but real. Elias froze, his breath catching with it. He met the mother's eyes and saw the shift, the faintest flicker of light in the dark. The infant coughed weakly, and Elias turned it onto its side, letting the Shallow breath steady. For I will restore health to you, and your wounds I will heal, declares the Lord. And in that moment the savannah seemed to breathe again. Far off, a bird called, as if the world itself had been holding its voice until now, but the battle was far from over. The baby's breaths were shallow, its eyes closed, its tiny fingers curling limply against Elias' shirt. It needed more than a miracle. It needed care that only time and constant vigilance could provide. Elias reached for a small thermal blanket, wrapping the fragile body with the same gentleness a father might use with his own newborn. The mother shifted closer, her massive head bent low, nostrils flaring as she scented her child, reassured by the faint warmth returning to its body. Her great hands twitched, the instinct to take the baby back almost overwhelming, but she didn't. She stood over Elias like a silent guardian, her presence both a warning and a blessing. He glanced up at her and in the quiet space between them spoke softly. "I'll bring it back to you," he said. Not because he believed she understood the words, but because some promises must be spoken aloud. Slowly, cautiously, he rose. To his feet, the infant cradled against his chest. The mother followed, each step measured, her gaze never leaving her child. Together they walked toward the jeep, a procession of two species bound by the same fragile thread of hope. The sky above burned with the mid-afternoon sun, and in the shimmering heat, Elias felt the weight of more than just the small body. In his arms, he felt the weight of a story older than either of them, the story of creation's bond between the human heart and the wild soul. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. If either falls down, one can help the other up. And here, in the golden light of Africa, those words were alive. Walking side by side in the dust, the jeep stood under the sparse shade of an acacia. Its faded green paint blistered from years of African sun, its metal frame rattling faintly. In the breeze like an old warrior breathing between battles. Elias approached slowly, every step deliberate, the infant still cradled to his chest. Behind him, the mother gorilla followed, not stalking, not charging, but moving with a slow, determined gait that spoke of both exhaustion and resolve. Her great hands curled into the dust with each step, leaving impressions that would be gone by tomorrow, but whose meaning would linger in Elias' heart forever. The space between man and beast was barely a dozen paces, yet it felt like an unbroken thread, invisible but unbreakable. When Elias reached the jeep, he gently placed the baby on a folded blanket on the passenger seat. The little chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, the tiny fingers twitching against the fabric. He opened his medical kit again, this time pulling out a small oxygen canister, a tool he rarely used, reserved for the most desperate cases. Fitting the mask over the infant's delicate face, he turned the valve. The soft hiss of oxygen was the only sound between them. The mother crouched nearby, her amber eyes fixed, not on Elias, but on the rhythm of her baby's breathing. She made no sound, yet every muscle in her vast frame seemed coiled around the moment. Elias looked at her, and in her silence he felt a plea more powerful than any cry. The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Here in the savannah's heart, man and animal stood as equals in grief and hope, the boundaries between species dissolved by a shared love so raw it defied the logic of the wild. Elias knew the drive back to the field clinic would be long. The dirt track twisting like a snake through miles of shimmering heat and shadowed glades. He started the jeep's engine, the deep rumble startling a flock of guinea fowl into sudden flight. The mother flinched but did not retreat. She walked beside the jeep as it rolled forward, her massive strides keeping pace with surprising ease. Every so often, she would lift her head to peer into the open window, checking the rise and fall of her baby's chest. The road was rough, each bump jostling the fragile body, so Elias slowed to a crawl, his eyes flicking between the track ahead and the infant beside him. The air smelled of dust and sun-baked earth, the heat pressing against his skin like a weight. The mother's shadow kept pace along the ground, a moving silhouette of strength and devotion. At one point, the jeep skirted a dry riverbed, and the slope forced Elias to shift gears, the engine growling. The sound made the mother hesitate. her broad hands curling into fists, but then she saw her child stir faintly, the oxygen mask still in place, and she pressed on. The savanna around them shimmered with heat haze, the horizon wavering like the surface of water. And yet, in the midst of this harsh, unrelenting land, there was a tenderness moving beside him, a living testament to the truth that love can make even the wildest hearts walk in peace. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Mile by mile, they carried that truth forward, the Jeep's wheels etching it into the dust dot by the time the low buildings of the field clinic came into view. The sun had begun its slow descent, the sky melting into hues of gold and deepening crimson. Shadows stretched long across the earth, as if the land itself was reaching toward the coming night. Elias pulled the Jeep to a stop near the clinic's side entrance, cutting the engine. The sudden quiet felt almost heavy after the hours of engine noise. He turned to check the infant. The breaths were still shallow, but more regular now, the faintest blush of color beginning to return to its lips. The mother appeared at the Jeep's side, her huge frame blotting out the fading sun. Her eyes darted between Elias and her child, her breath coming in slow, controlled exhales. Elias spoke gently, as one might to a frightened friend. "I have to take it inside?" he said. She did not understand the words, but she understood the movement as he lifted the baby from the seat. Her body tensed, every instinct in her screaming to reclaim her child, yet she stayed. She followed as Elias carried the infant into the cool, dim interior of the clinic. Inside, the scent of antiseptic hung in the air, a stark contrast to the wild perfume of dust and grass. He laid the baby on a padded table, adjusting the oxygen flow, listening to the fragile heartbeat with his stethoscope. Outside the doorway, the mother's massive silhouette filled the fading light, her hands resting on the ground, her head lowered just enough to see inside. Elias worked quickly, administering fluids through a tiny catheter, checking for fractures, monitoring the slow return of steady breathing. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works. And in that small room, with the last light of day spilling across the floor, man and gorilla stood at the edge of the same miracle, waiting for it to fully unfold. Night fell over the savanna like a vast velvet curtain, blotting out the gold of day and replacing it with the cool silver of moonlight. Inside the small field clinic, the world felt suspended between hope and loss. The air was still, save for the faint rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine and the slow ticking of the wall clock. Elias sat on a worn wooden stool beside the padded table, the tiny gorilla's frail body wrapped in a soft thermal blanket, its breath whispering against the mask. Every few minutes he adjusted the oxygen flow, checked the heartbeat, or gently massaged the tiny limbs to keep the blood moving. Outside the open doorway, a shadow never moved. The mother gorilla remained there, a silent sentinel in the night. Her great dark shape was etched against the faint glow of the stars, her amber eyes catching the moonlight like molten gold. Once, in the deepest hour of night, a hyena's distant whoop drifted across the grasslands, and her head snapped toward the sound, her body stiffening, but she did not leave. Not even for water, not even for rest. Elias felt the weight of her trust pressing against his shoulders as tangibly as if she had laid her great hand upon him. He thought of the countless wild creatures he had seen, many fierce, some timid, and how none had ever crossed this invisible bridge before. Man and beast, separated by an ocean of difference, now stood on the same shore, looking toward the same fragile hope. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. And so they waited together in the long dark hours, each heartbeat a small prayer sent into the quiet. When the first blush of dawn touched the horizon, it came softly, like the hand of a painter brushing gold into the edge of the sky. The clinic's walls caught the faintest warmth of that light, and the room seemed to exhale. Elias leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he saw it, the tiny gorilla's chest rising more deeply, more steadily than before. The little fingers twitched, curling faintly against the blanket. Then a small sound, not the cry of pain he had feared, but a weak, breathy murmur, the kind that belongs to the very young awakening from deep sleep. Elias' heart surged. He turned off the oxygen and gently lifted the baby into his arms, feeling a warmth there that had been absent for hours. The eyes fluttered open, dark and wide, reflecting the newborn day. Outside, as if sensing the shift. In the air, the mother gorilla rose from her crouch. Her massive frame filled the doorway, and Elias stepped toward her, cradling the child. For a heartbeat, they stood there, the moment hanging like a single drop of water about to fall. Then, with a reverence as old as the earth itself, Elias extended the infant toward her. The mother stepped forward, her immense hands closing around the small body with a tenderness that defied her strength. She pressed her face to her baby's fur, inhaling deeply, her shoulders shuddering with a sound halfway between a sob and a sigh. The baby clung weakly to her, and she held it close, swaying gently, the way mothers have swayed since the dawn of time. He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds. Outside, the savannah awakened around them, birds lifting their voices to the morning, the grass bending under the first stirrings of wind. But for Elias, the only world that existed in that moment was the one framed by a mother's arms and the heartbeat of the life she had feared lost. The sun rose higher, casting its full warmth across the clinic and the open land beyond. The mother gorilla, her child held against her chest, took a step backward into the light. She looked at Elias one last time, her gaze deep and steady, as if memorizing the shape of his face. There was no roar, no dramatic gesture, only that gaze, a silent acknowledgement that whatever boundaries existed between man and wild, they had been crossed, if only for this day. She turned, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of one who knows the value of what she carries. The infant lifted its small head weakly, its eyes catching the light as they vanished into the tall grass. Elias stood in the doorway, the early sun warming his face, his heart heavy and light all at once. He knew the wild would close around them, swallowing the sight, but it would not erase the memory. In the ledger of his long life, filled with storms, rescues, and countless stories told to eager ears, this would remain the one that could never truly be spoken, only felt. The wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, and a little child will lead them. And so the savannah returned to its endless rhythm, but for two souls, one man, one mother of the wild, it would never be quite the same again. The jungle was alive that day, but not in the way Elias had known it for decades. Every sound, every shadow, every whisper of wind through the thick canopy seemed to hum with a strange, unshakable urgency. His boots sank slightly into the damp earth as he pushed forward, the smell of wet foliage filling his lungs, the taste of rain still lingering in the air. His senses were sharpened into something beyond instinct, a kind of raw, primal awareness that made his heartbeat sync with the rhythm of the wild. Each step carried him deeper into a thicket of wait-a-bit thornbush, their hooked spines grasping at his sleeves as though the forest itself wanted to hold him back. He parted the branches, his breath hitching in his throat, and then the world stopped. Not 50 feet away, in a small clearing bathed in a muted shaft of afternoon light, stood a sight that tore through the very fabric of his understanding. A massive mother gorilla knelt in the grass, her shoulders trembling, her deep-set eyes awash in tears as she clutched the limp, still body of her infant. This wasn't an animal scene from the textbooks or documentaries Elias had studied. This was grief, pure, human-like, soul-shattering grief, playing out in the heart of the jungle. And then the unthinkable happened. She saw him, no roar, no chest-beating display, no charge of territorial fury. Instead, she rose slowly, as though lifting the weight of the entire world upon her broad shoulders, her baby still nestled in her massive arms. She walked toward him. The forest's constant chorus faded into a haunting silence, save for the soft hum of unseen insects. Elias stood frozen, caught between training and the primal pull of compassion. When she reached a few feet away, the great silver-backed queen of the jungle, a mother brought low by sorrow, knelt before him and extended her arms, offering her infant. It wasn't a threat, it was a plea, an unspoken surrender of instinct for the fragile thread of hope. Elias's chest constricted, and he thought of the verse his grandmother once told him under the glow of a kerosene lamp. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. In that moment he realized this was no wild creature following nature's cold, merciless script. This was a mother in any language of any species begging for her child's life. Protocol screamed, "Observe from a distance, do not interfere, let nature decide." But his soul roared louder, "Save her." He nodded once, slow and deliberate, the promise settling deep in his bones. Turning sharply, he sprinted toward his jeep, heart pounding, vision narrowing to a single urgent purpose. He tore open the back, yanked out his battered leather medical kit, and raced back to find her still there, still waiting, still trusting. Gently, with a reverence he had never known, he took the infant into his arms. Its tiny frame was terrifyingly light, its chest still, its pulse absent. His weathered hands moved with a precision honed over years of field emergencies. 2 fingers pressed rhythmically on the small chest, willing life back into its fragile body. Then, with the calm of a man walking a knife's edge, he drew a microdose of cardiac stimulant into a syringe, a final dangerous gamble. The mother's dark eyes locked on his, unblinking, her universe balanced on the edge of this human skill. The injection slid in. 1 second, 2, 10, nothing. Cold dread seeped into his veins. But then, a hitch in the tiny chest, a shallow, raspy cough no louder than a leaf brushing the ground. The infant's eyes fluttered, and breath, real breath, filled its lungs. A wave of relief so fierce it nearly buckled his knees surged. Through Elias, the mother's low, trembling call of joy was the mirror opposite of her earlier wails of despair. She had witnessed a miracle. But deep in the forest, the wild was never still for long. The joy in the clearing was raw and unfiltered, the kind of joy that could only come after standing on the edge of loss and being pulled back by the thinnest thread of grace. Elias held the baby close, feeling its shallow but steady breaths against his chest, each one a victory snatched from the cold grasp of death. The mother gorilla hovered beside him, not crowding, not threatening, but guarding, with an intensity that burned like fire. Her deep, rumbling, purr-like hum was a lullaby of relief and vigilance intertwined. But even in moments of triumph, the wild holds no guarantee of peace. From somewhere beyond the veil of leaves and shadows came a sound that froze the air. A guttural, mocking cackle that slithered between the trees like smoke. Another joined it, then another. The hair on Elias's neck prickled as he turned his head toward the tree line. Emerging from the dappled shade, their outlines shifting between sun and shadow, came a pack of spotted hyenas. Their movements were deliberate, confident, and coordinated, a slow, stalking advance marked by hunched shoulders and the unsettling curve of their grins. Their amber eyes glittered with a predatory hunger, scanning the scene with calculating precision. The earlier cries of distress had carried far, and now the scent of renewed life, the fragile, newborn kind, drifted through the air like a beacon to these opportunistic hunters. The mother gorilla's body stiffened, her nostrils flaring, as the low hum in her chest transformed into a deep, vibrating growl. Elias shifted his stance, one hand tightening protectively around the infant, the other instinctively reaching for the rifle slung across his back. But before he could even unclip the safety strap, the mother moved. With the unyielding force of a mountain rising from the earth, she planted her massive hands into the soil and stepped directly between him and the approaching danger. Her broad frame blotted out the light, casting Elias and the baby in her shadow. The sound that erupted from her chest was no longer a growl, it was a roar. A booming, chest-rattling thunder that seemed to shake the leaves themselves. She rose to her full height, pounding her chest in a rhythm that spoke of ancient power and primal defiance. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a fortress of flesh and fury, willing to face down death itself for the two beings behind her. The hyenas faltered for a moment, their laughter dipping into uneasy silence, but hunger is a ruthless master. They began to circle, their movements weaving a tightening noose, their strange vocalizations echoing in eerie harmony with the thumping of Elias's pulse. It was a standoff, and the odds were grim. And then, as though the forest itself had decided to intervene, the trees above exploded with life. Heavy rustles became thunderous crashes as massive silverbacks and strong adult females descended from the high canopy in a display of calculated might. They didn't stumble or scatter, they landed with the precision of an army taking its ground, forming a semicircle around Elias, the mother, and the infant. Their bodies were walls of muscle and resolve, their faces carved from the stone of ancestral strength. The sun caught on the silver saddles of the dominant males, turning them into gleaming war banners in the green shadow of the forest. The air became thick with the scent of power, the sound of synchronized roars blending into one earth-shaking declaration: this family will not be touched. The hyenas, once bold, now found themselves staring into the eyes of a dozen unyielding warriors. The courage that had driven them forward shattered like glass under the weight of that united force. One by one they turned, their laughter gone, their steps quickening into a retreat that became a panicked scatter. Within seconds, the clearing was theirs again. The guerrilla troops slowly relaxed, the electric tension in the air softening but never fully fading. The mother turned toward Elias, her eyes no longer clouded with desperation but lit with something deeper, recognition. She stepped close, her massive frame lowering until she was level with him. Then, with a slowness that carried the weight of intention, she reached out one leathery hand and placed it gently on his shoulder. It wasn't a shove. It wasn't a grip. It was a connection, a bridge between two beings who had met at the razor's edge of life and chosen compassion over fear. It was a gesture that seemed to speak the words of an old truth. Two are better than one, for if they fall, one will lift up the other. Then, with a final look at her baby, secure in Elias's arms, she turned and began leading her troop back into the shadowed sanctuary of the trees, leaving behind an unspoken promise that this bond would not be forgotten. The drive back to the conservation center was a blur of winding dirt tracks, rattling engine noise, and the constant rhythmic rise and fall of the tiny chest against Elias's arm. Every bump in the road sent a protective surge through him. Every glance in the rearview mirror at the fragile form in the passenger seat reminded him just how thin the line between life and loss could be. The mother gorilla's touch on his shoulder still lingered like a phantom weight, her silent trust echoing louder than any words could. When he finally arrived, the infant was whisked into the skilled hands of the on-site veterinary team, a close-knit group of professionals who moved with a kind of practiced urgency that came from years of working on the edge of the possible. Monitors were hooked up, fluids administered, warmth applied, and for hours Elias stayed just outside the small observation room, pacing like a restless tide. He knew the fight wasn't over, the baby's systems were fragile, its body still, clinging to life with a kind of stubborn grace that made his chest ache. Day turned to night, night bled into dawn, and still the team worked. He caught glimpses through the glass, a tiny hand curling around a caretaker's finger, a soft rise in its breathing, the first reflexive twitch of its legs. Each moment felt like a bead on a rosary of hope. And then, the moment came. The lead vet stepped out, her eyes rimmed red with exhaustion but lit with triumph. "He's stable," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Against all odds, he's going to make it." Elias closed his eyes, a wave of relief breaking over him so powerfully it left his knees weak. He thought again of that scripture that had anchored his soul through every trial: "Rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked." The words had never felt more alive than they did now, standing in the warm, humid air of that recovery room. Over the next few days, the baby's strength grew in steady, miraculous increments. His once limp body began to wriggle with the curiosity of life, his eyes open to take in the strange, safe world around him. Elias visited often, sometimes just sitting silently beside the enclosure, other times speaking softly as though telling bedtime stories to a child who didn't yet understand his words but felt their warmth. And then, when the time was right, he returned to the forest. No rifle, no medical kit, just himself. The path to that same clearing felt different now, lighter, as though the trees themselves remembered the last time and approved of this. return, he didn't wait long. A ripple in the greenery caught his eye, and then she emerged, the mother gorilla. Her steps were calm, her posture relaxed, no shadow of fear or desperation in her movements. And bounding ahead of her, a blur of dark fur and untamed energy, came the little one, strong, healthy, alive. The baby scampered toward him with the uncoordinated joy of youth, tugging playfully at the hem of his trousers as though they had always been part of each other's world. Elias knelt, laughter and tears breaking free in the same breath as the tiny hands climbed up his arm. The mother watched from a few feet away, her eyes deep with that same unspoken understanding they had shared in the clearing. No words, no sounds. Just a connection that ran deeper than language, the knowledge that in the great web of life, sometimes paths cross in ways that change everything. He knew then that this day, this story, would not be one shouted from rooftops or splashed across headlines. It would be a quiet legend whispered among those who walked the same wild paths, a testament to the truth that in the heart of the wild and the heart of a human, compassion is the one language we all understand. And as the three of them, man, mother, and child, stood together under the cathedral canopy of the forest, Elias felt that invisible, unbreakable thread that binds all living beings pull just a little tighter, holding them all in the same gentle, eternal knot.